Welcome to Discipleship for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material.
So picture this for a second, if you will. Your body is completely paralyzed.
Right.
You can't speak, you can't open your eyes, and your breathing is so shallow, an observer might actually think you're dead.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
It is. But inside, you aren't unconscious at all. You're experiencing the most intense electric joy imaginable.
Yeah, your mind is just suspended in this state of absolute unhindered union with the divine.
Exactly. And today we're taking a deep dive into the fifth mansions, specifically chapters 1 through 4 of a profoundly famous and honestly somewhat intimidating 16th century text, The Interior Castle.
It's a text that completely shatters our modern, comfortable categories of faith, you know.
Oh, absolutely. And what's fascinating here is that we are looking at a manual for the most extreme mystical union with God.
Right, but we are going to test it against the very grounded, everyday instructions of Jesus.
Yes. We're basically going to take this soaring 16th century Spanish castle and drop it right next to the dusty roads of Jesus's actual ministry.
I love that visual, bringing it right down to his commands to love your neighbor, serve others, carry your cross, and forgive your enemies.
Because that's the real test, isn't it? Our role today is to act as your thoughtful Christian mentors in this deep dive.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the intense historical context of this author, find the profound alignments with Jesus's core instructions for discipleship, and boldly highlight the tensions.
Because before we can even begin to evaluate this text, we have to understand the terrifying world this author was writing in.
Right. We can't just drop our 21st century mindset onto a 16th century Spanish nun. That just doesn't work.
No, it really doesn't. If we just read her words without the history, we completely miss the life or death stakes of what she's doing.
So let's look at Spain in 1577.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, the author is a Carmelite nun, right? And she's writing to her sisters. But she is writing in the dark shadow of the Spanish Inquisition.
Which changes everything.
Totally. At this time, the church is incredibly suspicious of anyone claiming direct, unmediated communication with God.
Especially women.
Yes, especially women. There was this widespread fear of groups called the Alumbrados, or the Illuminated Ones.
Right, and they claim to have such high mystical experiences that they supposedly no longer needed the sacraments or the church hierarchy.
Which, as you can imagine, the Inquisition did not like. They were actively arresting and investigating people for making the exact kinds of claims our author is about to make.
Wow, so she is basically walking a theological tightrope over a literal fire.
That is exactly it. And that completely explains the palpable anxiety in her writing about deception, you know?
Yeah, in her world, the devil isn't just like a metaphor for a bad mood or a poor ethical choice.
No, the devil is a highly active, brilliant agent capable of transfiguring himself into an angel of light to lead devout people astray.
And she warns her sisters about this explicitly.
Yeah.
Because these nuns are pursuing a life of intense, isolated prayer.
Right, so their desires are totally oriented toward pleasing God.
Exactly. The devil knows this. He knows he can't tempt them with obvious, gross sins.
So he has to use spiritual counterfeits.
Yes. He has to give them fake mystical experiences to breed spiritual pride.
That is so insidious. And, you know, I want to highlight a specific phrase she uses that really caught my attention.
Oh, which one?
She mentions this deep, visceral fear of half-learned men.
Oh, yes. That's a crucial concept here.
She actually says their shortcomings have cost her very dear in the past.
Right. And to a modern ear, that just sounds like a complaint about an annoying coworker who doesn't know his job.
Yeah, like a bad manager or something. But given the Inquisition context, a half-learned theologian evaluating her spiritual experiences could literally get her imprisoned.
That is the crux of the problem. A half-learned man in her vocabulary is a theologian or a spiritual director who has immense academic book knowledge.
But zero experiential knowledge of God.
Exactly. They know all the scholastic definitions of prayer, but they have never actually tasted the divine presence.
Which is why she is so fiercely protective of the genuine experiential encounter with God.
Yeah, she recognizes that putting an incredibly profound supernatural encounter into the hands of an academic who only understands the theory of religion is incredibly dangerous.
It leads to terrible spiritual advice.
It really does. So out of this high-stakes world, she delivers the heart of these chapters.
And the central message here, if I'm tracking, is the soul's total unhindered union with God.
Yes. She is trying to form a reader who holds absolutely nothing back. She says God will have it all for himself.
Which is moving way past just, keeping the rules or doing external good deeds.
Far past it. She describes a state where the soul completely dies to the world so that it may live more fully in God.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. She describes this union as a kind of spiritual safe room where the devil and even our own distracting thoughts cannot enter.
Right, but to understand the architecture of this safe room, we have to understand how she views the human mind.
Because she's using a very specific 16th-century framework, right?
Exactly. She relies on the scholastic idea of the faculties of the soul. These are generally understood as the memory, the understanding, meaning our intellect and logic, and the will.
Okay, got it. Memory, understanding, will.
And in the earlier stages of spiritual life, those faculties are highly active. You use your memory to recall Scripture.
Right.
You use your understanding to meditate on the life of Jesus, and you use your will to choose to love him.
But she says that in the fifth mansions, in this state of pure union, something radically different happens.
It really does. And she uses this brilliant concept of the little lizards.
I love this analogy. So in the outer mansions of the castle, there are venomous snakes, right? Which represent major sins and worldly attachment.
Yes, but by the time you get to the fifth mansions, the snakes are gone.
Thank goodness.
Right. But a few little lizards can still squeeze in through the cracks.
So what are these lizards, practically speaking?
The lizards represent the agile, distracting thoughts that proceed from the imagination and the memory.
Like when you sit down to pray and suddenly remember you need to buy milk.
Exactly. If we think about this through a modern psychological lens, it's remarkably similar to what neuroscientists call the default mode network.
Oh, that's fascinating. The brain's background chatter.
Yeah, it's that part of the brain that generates random chatter when you're trying to focus.
Hmm.
You sit down in silence and suddenly you're thinking about whether you left the oven on.
Or replaying an awkward conversation you had with a barista 3 years ago.
Yes, those are the lizards.
I think we all know those lizards intimately. You try to have a moment of silence and suddenly your brain is serving up a grocery list.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
But here is the mechanism she describes for the fifth mansions. In this specific state of union, even the lizards cannot enter.
Wait, really? How?
And it's not because you are fighting them off with a spiritual stick, it's because the door is sealed.
Wow. Sealed entirely.
Yes, God is in the very essence of the soul, and the faculties, the imagination, memory, and understanding are completely suspended. They're bypassed entirely.
Okay, which brings us to a profound and perhaps unnerving description. How does a soul actually achieve this safe room union?
Right, we move from the desire for union to the actual physical and spiritual experience of it. And she calls this prayer of union a delectable death.
A delectable death. That phrase alone is a paradox that just forces you to stop and think.
It really is. She says the faculties and the senses are entirely suspended. For the short time this condition lasts, maybe half an hour or so, the soul is without consciousness.
It's literally a swoon. The mind is dumbfounded. Neither hands nor feet can move. She even wonders if the body still has enough life to breathe.
Yeah, if someone walked into the room, they might think you had literally died.
That is wild.
And to explain the mechanism of how this happens without our own mental effort, she uses a really powerful biblical metaphor.
Locked room, right.
Exactly. She points out how Jesus entered the locked room with his disciples after the resurrection and said, "Pax vobis, peace be with you."
He didn't open the door. He didn't even knock. He just appeared in the center.
Yes. And she says God implants himself in the center of the soul in exactly the same way.
She also pairs that with the cellar of wine metaphor from the Song of Songs, doesn't she?
She does. In that ancient poem, the bride says, "The king brought me into the cellar of wine."
But our author points out a crucial nuance in the translation there.
Right. The text implies he put me there. The soul doesn't walk in.
The soul doesn't figure out the combination code to the cellar door.
Exactly. The king puts her there. We cannot force our way into this level of union by our own intellect or willpower. It is entirely God's work.
Okay, so let's run this up against our primary standard, the core instructions of Jesus for discipleship. Where does a literal, physical swoon fit into the Gospels?
Well, it aligns most powerfully with Jesus' instruction of total devotion.
Seeking first the kingdom.
Right. Jesus said a disciple cannot serve two masters. What this author is describing is the ultimate extreme realization of that devotion.
It is a state where self-will, personal ambition, and earthly attachments are not just deprioritized, they are completely and utterly suspended.
The soul belongs entirely to God, offering zero resistance.
But we have to name the massive tension here.
Let's hear it.
If we look at Jesus's actual instructions, they are almost entirely composed of verbs, active, conscious choices.
Seek, deny, take up.
Exactly. Seek the kingdom, deny yourself, take up your cross daily, give to the poor, forgive your enemies. Taking up a cross is heavy, grueling, waking work.
You definitely can't carry a cross in a swoon.
Right. So does this heavy emphasis on a passive, unconscious state where neither hands nor feet can move contradict Christ's call to an active, everyday faith?
That is the primary danger of mystical theology, honestly. If the absolute highest spiritual ideal is a literal physical swoon in a dark room, does that unintentionally demote the conscious act of making a sandwich for a homeless person?
Oh, that's a great point. Does it make the messy, waking obedience of biting your tongue when your spouse annoys you seem like lesser Christianity?
Which naturally leads to the question of effort.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting for me. If God just puts us in the cellar of wine and bypasses the doors of our senses, what are we supposed to do?
Right, what's our job?
Are we just spiritual couch potatoes waiting for a divine elevator? If I can't think my way there and I can't work my way there, do I just sit around and do nothing until God paralyzes me with joy?
Well, she anticipates this exact pushback.
She does.
Yeah, she knows her theology of grace sounds completely passive.
Yeah.
So to resolve this tension, she pivots from the moment of divine takeover back to the preparation phase.
Okay.
And she introduces what is arguably her most famous and most brilliant metaphor to explain exactly what the believer must do before God can act.
The silkworm and the butterfly.
It's a masterful analogy. You know, in 16th century Spain, silk production was a known industry, but the actual biology of how a worm became a moth was still viewed with a sense of wonder and mystery.
She starts by comparing the human soul to a tiny silkworm seed. It looks like a little peppercorn, dead and dormant.
But when the warm weather comes, which she equates to the heat of the Holy Spirit, the seed takes life.
And what is the very first thing it does? It starts feeding on mulberry leaves.
And the mulberry leaves are crucial here. They represent the general help God gives to everyone, specifically the remedies of the church.
Like what exactly?
She lists frequent confessions, good books, and sermons. This is the basic nourishment for a soul that was previously dead in sin and negligence. You have to eat the leaves to grow.
But then comes the pivot. When the worm is full grown, it doesn't just keep eating leaves forever.
No, it has to do the hardest part. It stops eating and starts spinning its silk.
It builds the tight, restrictive little house, the cocoon in which it is going to die.
And the author says this cocoon is Christ. She quotes St. Paul, "Our life is hid with Christ in God."
This is her direct answer to the question of human effort, isn't it?
Explicitly, she writes, "You see what we can do with God's favor. We build the cocoon, we spin the silk."
And the mechanism for spinning that silk is deliberate self-denial. She lists practicing penance, prayer, mortification, and obedience.
Hold on, we need to pause and define those terms.
Yeah, please do.
Because to a modern ear, words like penance and mortification sound like medieval torture or just being intensely embarrassed.
Right, like wearing a hair shirt or something. What did a 16th century nun actually mean by mortification?
Mortification literally means putting to death. It's not necessarily about physical flagellation, though that was present in her era. It's about starving the ego.
Starving the ego. I like that.
It is the deliberate, painful choice to put to death your need to be right. It's choosing not to have a last word in an argument.
Ouch. That's real.
Right. It's quietly serving someone without demanding recognition. That is the silk. Renouncing your self-love and your self-will is how you weave the cocoon.
She says, let the silkworm die. It has to die to become what it was meant to be.
And then after being hidden in the greatness of God, which is that delectable death, that short period of total union, the ugly, crawling worm comes right out of the cocoon as a beautiful white butterfly.
The soul doesn't even recognize itself. The transformation is absolute.
And look at how perfectly this mechanism mirrors Jesus' call to self-denial and cross-bearing.
Right. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.
For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. The spinning of the cocoon is the daily taking up of the cross.
The death of the worm is the losing of the life. It is devastating when you translate this into modern discipleship because it forces us to look at our own spiritual habits.
It really does.
I know I am incredibly guilty of this. We live in an era where we have an all-you-can-eat buffet of mulberry leaves.
Oh, absolutely.
We consume theology podcasts on our commute. We read the latest spiritual best-selling books. We go to church. We join small groups. We're absolutely gorging on the leaves.
But the tragedy is that a silkworm that only eats leaves and never spins silk just becomes a very fat worm.
Wow. A very fat worm.
It never transforms. The leaves, the sermons, the books, the podcasts, they're only meant to give the worm the strength to spin the silk.
So if you consume endless spiritual information, but you never do the quiet, restrictive, ego-crushing work of mortification, you are refusing the cocoon.
Exactly. Because we don't want to be inconvenienced.
We certainly don't want to die to our own opinions or our political tribes or our need to be validated.
Think about your own life for a second as you're listening to this. Look at your spiritual diet versus your spiritual output.
Right. Are you using the nourishment of scripture and community to actually weave a cocoon of self-denial?
Are you letting the ego die, or are you just becoming a well-educated worm?
That is a deeply convicting question. And the text gets even more paradoxical from here.
Let's assume you do the work.
Okay, I spin the silk.
You spin the silk, you enter the union, and you emerge as this beautiful white butterfly. You would naturally assume that life, after achieving total union with God, would be a blissful, tranquil float through a sunlit meadow.
Right, like you've achieved nirvana and now everything is easy. But she says the exact opposite.
She does. The butterfly is deeply, agonizingly restless.
She says it finds absolutely no peace in earthly things anymore and knows it has wings. How can it be content to just crawl along the ground?
Every worldly ambition or comfort it sees leaves it totally dissatisfied.
And it isn't just a vague sense of boredom with the world, is it?
No, not at all. The soul now experiences an extreme, overwhelming grief. But we must be very careful to distinguish what this is and what it isn't.
Yeah, let's clarify that. This is not clinical depression.
Correct. Depression is an inward collapsing, a numbing of the senses, a heavy fog.
Right.
The mystical grief she describes is an outward explosion of extreme empathy. It hurts because the soul is hyper-alive, not because it is numb.
She describes it in incredibly violent terms. She says this grief tears the soul to pieces and grinds it to powder.
And it happens without effort, sometimes suddenly crashing over the soul.
Now, in the text, she specifies that this grief is over seeing God offended. And I want to bring up a historical note here. She specifically mentions grieving the loss of heretics and Moors, alongside Christian souls she fears are condemned.
Right. And as we unpack this, it is vital that we act as impartial observers of history.
Exactly. We are looking at a 16th-century text.
The author is writing in 16th-century Spain, during the height of the Inquisition and the aftermath of the Reconquista. Her world is defined by intense religious and socio-political conflict.
She's using the specific labels of her era.
Our goal here in this deep dive is not to endorse the political dynamics of 1570s Europe, obviously.
No, we are looking underneath those labels to understand the underlying spiritual mechanism.
Right. She is experiencing a crushing, unbearable empathy for humanity. She is literally pulverized by the thought of any human soul being separated from the love of God.
The mechanism of this empathy is what's so fascinating to me. She compares this grinding, powder-like grief to the agonizing torment Christ felt witnessing offenses against his Father.
Yes. She theorizes that for Jesus, witnessing the constant rebellion of the world and the loss of souls was actually far more painful than the physical passion of the cross.
Because with the physical cross, he could see the end of the trial and the redemption it purchased.
But the sight of human rebellion was a constant agonizing splinter in his heart.
Which aligns beautifully with the instruction of total devotion. The soul's heart is beating in perfect rhythm with the heart of Jesus.
It feels what he feels. It grieves what he grieves.
But Rick and he hit a massive tension.
We do.
If the ultimate state of a united soul is this powder-grinding, agonizing grief, doesn't that drift away from Jesus' promise of peace?
That's a huge question.
Jesus brings the good news. He promises the peace that passes understanding. He says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." So if a modern believer achieves spiritual maturity, are they really meant to live in a state of unbearable torment, weeping at their desk because they are so aware of the sins of the world?
That is the tightrope walk of the entire mystical tradition. How do you hold supreme peace and supreme grief simultaneously?
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, the author acknowledges this paradox. She admits the butterfly has never been quieter or more at rest in its life internally, in its submission to God's will.
But externally?
Externally, as it looks at the brokenness of the world, it is deeply restless. The peace is in the submission. The agony is in the love.
So what does that actually look like in a modern workplace or a modern family? It feels a bit like having a spiritual superpower, but the superpower just makes you incredibly heavy and miserable.
I get that. But the key is understanding what this grief propels the butterfly to do. This grief is not meant to paralyze you in a corner.
Okay, what does it do?
It is meant to absolutely obliterate your attachment to trivial things. If you are deeply, profoundly grieved over the spiritual state of humanity, you immediately stop caring about office politics.
Oh, that makes sense. You stop caring about the square footage of your neighbor's house or winning a petty argument on the internet.
Exactly. It recalibrates your entire scale of what actually matters.
And to prevent this mystical grief from turning into pure, paralyzing navel-gazing, the author drops a massive reality check.
This might be the most important pivot in the entire text.
She brings the soaring, elevated theology right back down to earth with a thud. She tells her sisters that true union with God is proven in the kitchen, not in the cloister.
This is where we see her sheer brilliance as a spiritual director, and where she completely aligns with the active, waking commands of Jesus.
She issues a severe warning against people who get so wrapped up in their mystical prayers that they are afraid to stir.
Yes, or afraid to indulge in a moment's thought for fear of losing that delicate, fuzzy feeling of devotion.
She just states it so bluntly. What the Lord desires is works.
She gives them an incredibly practical scenario. She says, if you see a sick sister to whom you can give some help, never be affected by the fear that your devotion will suffer.
Leave your prayer. Take pity on her.
If she is in pain, you feel pain too. If necessary, fast so that she can eat.
She also dives deeply into the internal attitudes required for this, doesn't she?
She does. She says you should rejoice when someone else is highly praised.
Which is easy if you have true humility, because you'll actually hate being praised yourself.
Right. And if you see a fault in someone else, you should be as sorry about it as if it were your own fault, and try to conceal it to protect their dignity.
This snaps so perfectly into alignment with Jesus. It is the absolute embodiment of humility and service, the law of love and fruitfulness.
Absolutely. Jesus said a tree is known by its fruit. He didn't say a disciple is known by how deeply they can swoon in silent prayer.
He got up from supper and washed dirty feet. He told the story of the Good Samaritan who interrupted his journey to care for a bleeding man.
The author insists here that practical love for your neighbor is the only sure sign of your love for God.
She tells her readers that you can never be absolutely sure if you are truly loving God, because the heart is deceitful and we can invent feelings of devotion. But you can know quite well if you are loving your neighbor.
Because it is measurable.
Right.
Did you feed them? Did you forgive them?
Right. The further advanced you are in loving your neighbor, the greater your love for God will be. This requires deep discernment for the modern reader, though, to separate the medieval mystical wrapping from the practical core.
That's exactly it. You don't have to experience a literal, physical suspension of your nervous system to achieve true union with God.
Doing God's will by serving your neighbor when it is deeply inconvenient is true union.
She literally writes, that is true union with his will. Feeding the sick sister is the union.
It dismantles the false separation between the contemplative life and the active life.
It is the ultimate resolution to the Mary and Martha dynamic. She is asserting that if your high contemplation doesn't immediately drive you to wash the dishes for a sick friend, your contemplation is an illusion.
It's just spiritual narcissism.
Exactly.
Think about how this applies tomorrow morning. You wake up early, the coffee is hot, the house is quiet, you're reading scripture, and you feel incredibly close to God. You're having a profound moment.
We all love those moments.
And then your toddler wakes up screaming, or your spouse interrupts to ask where the car keys are, or your phone rings with a crisis from a needy coworker.
And our instinct is to protect our spiritual peace and snap at the person interrupting us.
Yes. But the practice she is demanding is this. Treat the interruption not as a distraction from God, but as the actual work of God.
Leaving your peaceful prayer to serve that interruption with joy and patience is the literal test of whether your prayer was real in the first place.
It is a devastating test because it exposes how often we use spiritual time as an escape from the demands of love.
And this leads her perfectly into discussing the subtle traps that wait for us even when we think we are successfully navigating the spiritual life.
Right, the hidden dangers of self-deception. To illustrate this, she brings up the brilliant imagery of the worm that gnawed through Jonas's ivy.
She is referring to the biblical story of the prophet Jonah, right?
Yes. He was sitting outside Nineveh, pouting, but enjoying the shade of a large plant God provided. Then God sent a tiny worm to chew the stem, and the whole plant withered and died overnight.
And she says there are tiny worms that will gnaw through our spiritual virtues just as effectively.
So what are these worms? Because they aren't massive, scandalous sins like murder or theft.
No, they are tiny, hidden, entirely acceptable societal sins. Self-love, self-esteem, censoriousness.
Let's define censoriousness. What is she getting at there?
Censoriousness is a hypercritical spirit. It is the habit of being overly judgmental of our neighbors, scrutinizing their motives, being secretly pleased when they fail, or constantly noticing their minor flaws.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is a fundamental lack of charity disguised as discernment.
She warns about the devil's incredible wiles here. She says the devil will run 1,000 times around hell if, by doing so, he can make us believe we have a single virtue that we actually do not possess.
He wants us to build up imaginary virtues that exist only in our imagination, but not in our actual will.
And she gives a devastatingly funny yet convicting example of this. She mocks those who, when they are alone in solitary prayer, make grand, sweeping declarations of devotion.
Right. They tell God that for his sake they would gladly be publicly humbled, put to open shame, or even martyred.
They imagine themselves as bold saints. But then, an hour later in real life, someone accuses them of a minor mistake they didn't do, and they completely lose their temper.
They try to conceal the slightest everyday failure to protect their reputation.
I read that and immediately felt exposed. It is so relevant to how we operate today. Think about the modern equivalent.
It's social media, isn't it?
Totally. It is the person who curates a beautiful, highly moral aesthetic online. They post long, beautifully written essays on social media about the importance of radical empathy, deconstruction, or theological purity.
They get hundreds of likes and feel incredibly virtuous. They imagine they are champions of love.
But then, an hour later, they absolutely scream at their family member, or they leave a deeply cruel, sarcastic comment on a stranger's post.
The imagination is holy. They imagine themselves as a virtuous person, but the will is empty.
Exactly. When it requires an actual act of the will to be kind in a hidden moment, they fail entirely.
This is a radical expansion of Jesus' instruction on secret obedience. Jesus warned against doing righteous deeds to be seen by other men.
But this author takes it a terrifying step further.
She does. She warns against doing righteous deeds in your imagination to be seen by yourself.
That is so profound. We can construct a deeply spiritual persona in our own minds, feeling very proud of our mystical insights, while our actual hidden lives are completely infested with censoriousness and defensiveness.
True humility isn't dreaming about being burned at the stake for Jesus.
No. True humility is quietly accepting when your spouse points out that you loaded the dishwasher wrong without getting defensive and reciting a list of all the things you did right that day.
Defensiveness, the need to be right, the tiny judgments we make about people's outfits or behavior, these are the worms of Jonas's ivy.
And if we connect this back to the grand theme of the Fifth Mansions, the total union with God, she is laying down a terrifying spiritual law.
She is saying that these tiny worms will absolutely destroy the union.
You could have experienced the most profound, sensory-suspending, mystical prayer in the world, but if you harbor censoriousness against your neighbor, your virtues are dead.
The union is broken. The butterfly falls out of the sky.
So if it is that fragile, if a tiny worm of defensiveness can eat the whole thing, how does anyone actually lock this union down permanently without losing their mind to anxiety?
That's the big question.
We've been put in the cellar of wine. We've emerged as a butterfly. We are trying to serve in the kitchen and avoid the worms. Where does it actually lead?
This brings us to the final chapter's warning, where she introduces the concept of the spiritual betrothal.
Right. To understand how to secure the union, she uses the metaphor of an ancient courtship.
She compares this entire Fifth Mansion experience to a brief meeting before a betrothal.
Because in her culture, a betrothal wasn't just an engagement, right?
Correct. It was a legally binding precursor to marriage. But before the betrothal is signed, the two parties might have a very brief, highly supervised meeting just to see if they are suited for each other.
She calls it a union of love with love. In a secret, incomprehensible way, the soul gets to see who this divine spouse is that she is preparing to take.
She says that by means of the natural senses, you couldn't understand in 1,000 years what the soul understands in this briefest space of time during this mystical meeting.
But here is the critical warning. Because it is only a brief meeting, the soul is not yet fully secure.
The contract hasn't been finalized. They are not yet in the final permanent mansions of the castle. And the devil knows this window of vulnerability exists.
And the devil marshals all the powers of hell to win this advanced soul back.
The stakes are infinitely higher now. Why? Because a soul that has tasted this level of union, if it stays faithful, is a massive threat to the kingdom of darkness.
She cites historical figures to prove this, right? Figures like St. Ursula, St. Dominic, St. Francis, and Ignatius of Loyola.
She notes how many multitudes of souls were converted purely because of the overflow of their deep union with God.
The devil knows that if he can corrupt a soul at the fifth mansion, he doesn't just win one person, he prevents the conversion of thousands.
To keep her readers sober and vigilant, she gives a chilling biblical precedent. She reminds them of Judas Iscariot.
Judas enjoyed the continuous companionship of the apostles. He had literal physical communion with God incarnate.
He listened to Jesus' actual words, face to face. He performed miracles, and yet he was entirely lost.
This reflects the absolute necessity of ongoing repentance and faith. The journey isn't over just because you had a spiritual high.
No, you don't get to retire from discipleship because you visited the fifth mansion.
In fact, the higher you ascend, the more watchful you must be. It's incredibly easy to get swept up in the intense, almost romantic imagery of being the bride of Christ and completely forget the rigorous, agonizing demands of the betrothal.
She tells us exactly how to maintain our footing. She says we must continually ask God in our prayers to keep us in his hand.
Realizing that if he leaves us for a single second, we will instantly fall back into the depths.
We must have zero confidence in our own strength. And practically, she says we must relentlessly monitor what progress we make in the virtues, specifically in our love for each other and our genuine desire to be thought least of.
The betrothal is just the beginning of the real work. It demands a total, continuous surrender of the will.
The butterfly can never, ever go back into the cocoon.
It must learn to fly in the open air, amidst the storms of life, carrying the immense grief of love and constantly proving the reality of that love by how it treats the other butterflies.
That is a beautiful way to put it.
We've covered a massive amount of theological ground today in this deep dive. We've talked entirely about the soul's intense journey toward God.
From the safe room where the lizards can't enter, to the paralysis of the cellar of wine.
Right, to the agony of love, all the way down to the soapy water of the kitchen sink. But I want to leave you with this final provocative thought as we close.
Let's hear it.
If the silkworm transforms completely to become the butterfly, it means the version of yourself that eventually achieves perfect union with God might be entirely, fundamentally unrecognizable to the person you are today.
Oh, wow.
The opinions you hold, the grudges you nurse, the ambitions you cherish, they all have to be pulverized in the cocoon. It requires a complete dissolution of your current ego. Are you actually ready to be completely unmade?
That is the question we all have to sit with.
That's the heart of this section. This is discipleship for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.